Here I am visiting the Pantheon a couple of years ago. The only reason I did this was, well, partly just to show you that I was there, and partly to show how these crypts have been added onto it. That's actually holding the casket there of Vittorio Emanuele somebody, Padre della Patria, meaning the father of his country. But I wanted to show this picture for a kind of a humorous reason too. So here's a close-up, and it just happens that the person you see pictured here, which is the skinnier me, well, here's a bust that I thought looked rather similar. Oh, there we go. Is it similar? Well, only just generally. Of course, Vespasian didn't have eyeglasses on, did he? This example I included here, and so did Gombrich, because it's an example of the Roman use of statuary. You might call this a portrait in marble. Realize the Greeks created statuary like this, sculpture, because they were attempting to display an idealized beauty of the human form. The Roman use of statuary like this was a whole lot more pragmatic. They wanted people to know what the emperor looked like for a couple of reasons. First of all, if you came to town, it's a nice idea for you to know who's in charge rather quickly, for the same reason they put the emperor's likeness on coins. But another reason was, it didn't take too long after emperors established themselves in the Roman Empire, about 50 years BC, for emperors to flatter themselves and regard themselves as deities. At first, it seemed to be a notion that the emperor was voted to deity by the Roman Senate after he died, and then some emperors eventually got the notion that they were God on earth and they were just walking around as a deity. Many copies of busts like this would have been created and placed in various places, and actually you were supposed to worship it because it was a picture of the deity. This, of course, is what the Jews and the Christians would not do, and it put the Christians in a very bad light eventually with the Roman emperors. Roman use of statuary, practical. Make a likeness that really does look like the person. So here we see baldness, a little bit of hair up here. We see a face that is stern. This is a Roman general, after all. You don't mess with them. It comes across in the face. He probably doesn't cut you very much slack. Is this idealized beauty? Well, probably not. In fact, we can be quite certain not, because this kind of a bust showed you what the person looked like. And here's Julius Caesar done in a black sort of a rock, and this is probably very much what he looked like. It doesn't have the same idealized notion of beauty that the Greeks had. Instead, it's actually to be a likeness of the person, probably pretty close to what he really looked like. Here's another monument in Rome called Trajan's Column. This is similar to what you saw in ancient times in the Middle East with the Assyrians and the Sumerians and the Babylonians, creating a monument that tells a story. Here's a close-up. Notice you see just a hint of one of these bands here, but here you see quite detailed, with a little bit of the stonework missing here. Looks like this might have been a kind of a cement applied to a column and shaped in this way when it was wet, but very detailed carving. Trajan is celebrating the glory of a victory here with this upward ascending spiral that goes around and around and around this column here. And actually, by the time you get some distance up, you can't really see this detail anymore. So what's the point? What's the point of having a column this tall, and then here a statue at the top of it, where you really can't see most of what's going on with this detail? Well, what we suspect is that this was kind of in ancient times the way of doing the same things that the Middle Eastern civilizations did in telling people now and people in the future about this victory, with the intention of perhaps not only preserving the idea of this victory, but making the victory stick for all time by proclaiming it. And in fact, this might be kind of the ancient way of broadcasting the news, because all of this becomes visible, at least in theory, to people a great distance away. So this is broadcasting the news of this victory throughout the world. And that's just a thought, but I think that's pretty similar to what the Romans might have thought. Gombrich includes just a little bit about Indian art. The Roman Empire did extend as far as northern India. Some elements of the artistic use of statuary percolated out to the provinces and even to India. This is a story of Buddha leaving his home in the middle of the night, little creatures here come to muffle the sound of the horse's hoofs by carrying the horse and not letting his hoof strike the ground, because he's trying to sneak away from his parents' residence and establish himself as an ascetic away from civilization for a good long while. When the Romans did reach India, some of the elements of their depiction inherited from the Greeks about how to actually draw people, and here, these probably looked more like Romans than they did like people who lived in India. But after a few hundred years, Indian art developed its own type of stylized identification of the deities with these type of arched eyebrows and eyes that look rather Asian. And we won't talk much about Indian art. It's an interesting topic, and I'd like to include more of it in this course in the future. But given the fact that Gombrich didn't cover it very much, and there's so much to cover in 10 weeks, we'll just basically touch on this with the notion that Roman influence did extend that far east in Asia. Here is a wall painting that Gombrich labels as figure 82. This is from a Jewish synagogue. A little bit about the Jewish culture. First of all, it's rather unusual to have pictures of people in synagogues. The thinking was that these were not things to be worshipped, that maybe it was a bit blasphemous to even put people's faces here, but in some synagogues this was done. More to the point, though, what is the purpose of this art? Like much of the religious art that follows in the Roman Empire and in the Middle Ages, and even down to the present day, the purpose of this art was to remind people of a story, because many people couldn't read. Think about it. What was the literacy rate? A very small proportion of people could read. They were told religious stories, and in this case the story is Moses striking a rock and water flowing out to each of the 12 tribes of Israel wandering around in the desert in the Exodus. So that's why we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There were 12 tribes of Israel. Here we have a menorah, traditionally associated with Jewish culture and the synagogue. And this tells the story, reminds people of the story of Moses striking the rock and God providing water to the people of Israel. You'll notice the artistry isn't the important point here. This depiction is rather crude if you compare it to the way Greek art represented folds of clothing. And there isn't really any attempt here to be realistic at all in showing this water flowing in a natural way. It's simply just a channel here, almost like a fire hose. The point of this is to show the emergence of water from this act and everybody in each Israeli tribe benefiting from it. So art to tell a story becomes a technique that carries through the Christian era all throughout the Middle Ages. Now, here's another interesting thing. This comes from a sarcophagus of a Christian who died in the very early Christian era in Rome. Rome converted to Christianity in 312, and throughout that 4th century, that is the 300s, the religion was established in all parts of the empire. This, though, shows a very interesting combination of the Christian influence. This is Jesus, and these are 2 apostles. But notice here, Jesus is sitting on the earth held up by Atlas. So a mixture here of Christian theology and Greek and Roman mythology. It's kind of interesting because it was a gradual process where one religious culture replaced another, where Christianity replaced pagan cultures. Notice also here the influence of Greeks, the Greek columns, entirely decorative, because this is really just the side panel, one of a number of pictures like this, a side panel of a coffin. Also, it's kind of interesting to notice how Jesus is depicted. It always reminds me in this illustration of Thomas Jefferson, if you look at a nickel. Why is Jesus pictured this way? Well, there are no pictures of Jesus, really. There is nothing from the time of Jesus that says anything about what he looked like. So people, when they picture Jesus, they tend to picture him like themselves or like whoever is in charge of that particular society.